Hello and welcome to the first official episode of the Distil-Nation New Zealand podcast. My name's Tom, and this is Cameron. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk whiskey. I'm excited to talk New Zealand whiskey.
Yeah.
And
what are we talking about then today? It is New Zealand whiskey.
It is indeed.
So I think today, as the first episode of this podcast, you and me are both just whiskey enthusiasts. I mean, I make whiskey as well, you know.
That you do.
I think that it's a really good idea to just go over an overview of New Zealand whiskey. What's the industry? Who's involved? You know, what spirits are being made? And I think the two choices we've picked here, I think they're two really good ones that are easy to access for everybody.
Yes.
And that have, Thomson's been around for a long time. And Pokeno's new onto the scene, but not actually so new, right? So
that's exactly not a new distillery by any stretch, but new on the scene, I think is a great way of putting that. But who are you, Tom, and what gives you the credibility to talk about New Zealand whiskey?
Well, I don't know if I have any credibility, really. But my background here is here at the distillery. I run and own Herrick Creek Distillery here in Christchurch, and I'm making corn whiskey, corn moonshine, and some gin from our whiskey and moonshine alcohol as well. As somebody who used to do a bit of YouTube reviewing on whiskies prior to my distilling days, I'm looking forward to this different format to chat about them. Because I think to be able to just discuss it with someone else and really go back and forth and be able to really explore what you're what are you smelling and what am I smelling, and then kind of see, is one of us way off, or what's up, what's what. But yeah, my distillery is sort of where my credibility in air quotations comes from. What about you, Cameron? Why are you a credible person?
Yeah, and I think it is that Kiwi self-deprecation of saying, well, am I? So Scotch whiskey was my first love and was introduced into that through the family. Culturally and historically, that is very much where my love lies and where I first got introduced to whiskey. And quite a few years ago now, I saw a gap in the market for affordable introductory kind of whiskey tastings and events. So I again started up my own. I'm trained historian, qualified historian, former journalist, moved into marketing. So all my life I've been about telling a good story.
Yeah.
That is what I have always done. And I thought, okay, well, I'll take some of this. There's a gap in the market for running affordable whiskey tastings where very much accessible, affordable whiskey was what's on offer. Not the rare, not the exclusive. There were other entities doing those things, full power, full credit to them. Yeah. But okay, let's get into something like this. And as I started that, the New Zealand whiskey scene really started taking off. And people were asking me questions. Would you... And in fact, that's how we first met.
I was going to say, that's how we met, yeah.
Because I saw the appetite, and I said, all right, well, I'm going to host a night. Usually it's a mainly Scotch, and I'd have, one or two New Zealand. And I said, no, I'm going to have a New Zealand whiskey night and just feature New Zealand whiskey and talk about that. And some of your mates stitched you up.
They sure did, yeah. And we were sitting there all night having a great time, I must say, at your event. And suddenly one of my friends, I remember, do you know him? And I said, no, I don't know the guy. And he stands up and he pulls you over. Hey, do you know Tom from Herrick Creek? Something like that.
He's making a New Zealand whiskey. Yeah. And then he said, would you feature his whiskey at your next event? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely.
You played it very smoothly. However, much you would have thought that was an insane request, but you played it incredibly smooth.
No. It was like, a distiller who wants to work with me and
little did you know, I was in the garage at the time.
Yes, that's right. You were distilling out of your garage, and And yeah, it's really gone from there. And so yes, I still on Discovering Drams review whiskey, mainly whiskey, and talk about other things spirits related. But this was our chance to really hero and champion New Zealand spirits, New Zealand whiskey, the awesome stuff that's happening here in New Zealand, because there's not really anybody else doing that to a bigger extent.
Yeah, this is a good raw conversation, you know? We don't need to act too much about this, really, do we? Like, it's just a good way to... Well, we got a knocking on the wall.
Neighbours next door.
It is a good way to have that chat without just worrying about the pressures of TikTok 60 seconds and stuff like that, you know? Like, we actually get to sit here and enjoy it.
And there's heaps of people, both on podcasts and on TikTok, talking about bourbon.
Yep.
That's great.
Yep.
They can do that.
Yep.
But it's actually having these conversations about something that's uniquely New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm looking forward to that. So, before we get into it, what is New Zealand whiskey? Starters, are there guidelines, and is it legally protected?
So, New Zealand whiskey is very loosely protected by the New Zealand Australia Food Guidelines, and that is a law, and that doesn't give us a lot of a framework for what could be a New Zealand whiskey. It just says it has to be made in New Zealand and have the characteristics of a whiskey. You know, that's it. That's all it says in the actual law at the moment. However, there is a professional group of distillers called Distilled Spirits Aotearoa, and it's a professional association making up probably now hundreds of small craft distilleries here in New Zealand. And a couple of years ago, we went through and actually came up with a definition guidelines for what makes a proper New Zealand whiskey. What could you call that, right? And this was a big step because, you know, other countries have gotten lost at this stage. You know, Japan at one point, they were importing Scotch and labeling it as Japanese whiskey, you know, and suddenly the industry just lost all credibility, you know. And I think that's what the New Zealand distillers were worried was going to happen, you know. But they didn't want somebody importing a bunch of whiskey, calling it New Zealand whiskey, and then just lose all credibility. And now all the distilleries are shit out of luck, if you will, for any other reason, you know?
Well, see, I remember when this conversation was happening, and I was at a trade event. There were a whole bunch of distilleries being represented, and talking to this one guy, and he had made a whiskey out of, I think it was walnuts, and he was upset at what the DSA was wanting to do, because he was saying, well, I can't call this spirit that he had made out of walnuts. He said, well, under this new thing, I wouldn't be able to call this whiskey. Fair, yeah. And I'm looking at him going, mate, it's walnuts. Yeah. Like, can you really call it a whiskey anyway? Yeah. Which, prior to the Distilled Spirits Aotearoa adopting this framework, he could make a spirit from walnuts and call it whiskey.
Absolutely. Yeah, and he did. I do remember that. But here's the problem. Here's the real big problem with these guidelines is now that, you know, they exist, it's not against the law for someone to leave the DSA and just go do it anyway. You know, there's no law that says you can't do that, which, you know, is unfortunate. I know the groups, you know, lobbying to get this into law, but it's years away probably, you know, at least. But anyway, the definition itself.
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
Back to that.
It's very simple. It has to be made mashed, distilled, fermented, and I believe even bottled in New Zealand. And it has to be made from cereal grain, and it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years in a cask no bigger than 700 liters. So those are the rules right now. And but that's just to be called a New Zealand whiskey in general. There is also a separate definition on what is a New Zealand single malt whiskey.
Right.
The big difference with that one is that it has to be made from barley, of course, made at a single distillery, and it has to be distilled through a predominantly copper still, which is a unique requirement that I don't think anyone else in the world has that in their guidelines, if I'm being honest.
So to actually specify copper still?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Like if you were to go to... I don't think even in Scotland, I don't think they have that as a requirement to make Scotch, you know?
They do, and I want to check this one, they do specify that it can't be a to single malt, that
single malt.
definition, that it's got to be a pot still versus a column.
Right.
They do specify that.
Yeah. But I don't think they specify the metal, do they?
I'd have to look.
It was something to look up. Yeah,
all right, I'll check that.
But that was a unique requirement at the time, and it was actually quite a big discussion among the distillers on whether that was necessary or not. I think at the end of the day, it's a good choice. I think it's there can be really no huge argument that copper does have a good impact on spirit. So if you want to make a country of better whiskey, then you need the best, I guess, metal, if you will. Yeah. So there we are.
Okay.
New Zealand whiskey.
There's the definition.
Yeah.
Now, which one are we going to dive into first?
I reckon we should start with Pokeno.
Yeah.
And I think that's because Pokeno is, like we said, the newer one on the scene. Oh, that was a pretty poor pop, eh?
Oh.
Yeah. All right.
Well, okay. New on the scene in that they really... they exploded onto the market in 2022.
Yep.
With, and I have to say, coming out with a core range of 3 and a couple of single barrel limited edition, and they've only built on that.
Yeah.
They have only expanded on that, coming out with more seasonal releases, limited editions, all of these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But the distillery itself, they have been, unlike some who start crowdfunding and sell gin or vodka or whatever to bring in cash flow.
Yeah.
They stayed very quiet and very beneath the radar and just put away casks.
Yep.
And then bang, came out with a real big splash.
It's like an explosion. Yeah, really. Like, I mean, the fact that they're coming out with 3 mainline whiskies that are available all the time, and they're available worldwide now.
They're expanding.
Yeah. Full 700ml bottles, which is not to be understated in this, this
not
area.
At all.
And then, they're limited release ones for that initial release was just pretty incredible, really. And it's a huge operation.
It is a big, big operation. And, so to say, the distillery itself, they've been making for about 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm just trying to remember how big their stills were. That's what I'm just trying to currently remember.
At this point, what we need for even our international followers, we need to get a map of New Zealand, and then to say, one, just to show where New Zealand is in relation to the rest of the world, and then to say Pokeno is, you've got Auckland.
This is their website.
Their website is great, and this isn't a slight on them personally, but any website that I land on where music or sounds automatically start playing as the default, no.
Yeah.
That's I'm not picking on them in particular. That just goes for all websites. Don't just automatically start playing. So we need to establish where New Zealand is. Auckland, right up at the top there, and then Pokeno is about a 90-minute drive south from there. So in terms of the country, it's a relatively subtropical climate, where they are also quite humid and year-round generally quite warm. Doesn't typically reach sub-zero freezing kind of temperatures in the winter, but in the summer, conversely, can certainly get up to high 30 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, definitely warm. I think it's a good idea if we maybe just say, it's a North Island whiskey. These are actually both North Island whiskies.
Yes.
And I think it's a good idea if we maybe distinguish that, maybe as we go forward and just let people know which region it actually does come from. Of course, we can say the Waikato, but it doesn't mean anything to some people.
If you're for overseas listeners. So this is the origin, ex-bourbon barrel, and so I think if you were looking for any spirit in generally, let's clarify that. Any whiskey generally, if you are looking for the purest expression of that distillery, typically speaking, virgin oak or ex-bourbon barrel is generally what you would go for.
And that's why if I was going to go today and introduce someone to New Zealand whiskey for the first time, I'd probably show them this bottle. I'd probably say, give this a smell, give this a taste. This is probably the closest to something you've tried elsewhere. You know what I mean? But It's not really.
Honestly, this is, if somebody was new to whiskey full stop, let alone New Zealand whiskey, the nose on this is very light, it's very floral and sweet, got good hints of vanilla in there, and there's certainly there's nothing big, bold, overstated that's going to scare anybody off. It's lovely and subtle.
That's what drew me to buying this bottle in the first place, because we did do the tasting back in the day when they came to town.
Yep.
It was just how light and bright and sweet the nose was. And
Yes.
that is, a big influence from that bourbon cask, for sure. But I think it does speak to their distillation as well. Because they're using, I've looked it up, it's 3,600 litre stills, 2 of them, I believe. And actually, I'm going to read you the description that they put on the website for this here. So, Pokeno Origin celebrates our unique place in the world, produced from the finest local barley and unrushed through fermentation and distillation to enhance body and flavor. We mature only in first fill bourbon casks. It is an incredibly sweet and round whiskey with beautiful citrus, honey, grapefruit, and creamy toffee notes, giving way to a complex and lingering finish, 43% alcohol.
I'm not sure about the grapefruit, but honey, absolutely. Hint of citrus, definitely. And there's I find a toastiness in there as well. So whether that's barrel char, but it's certainly like a kind of just gentle honey on toast kind of notes. It's in terms of whiskey generally, but especially for a New Zealand whiskey, this is very accessible, very inviting. 43 is just a wonderful introduction to whiskey generally, but New Zealand whiskey especially.
As soon as you said that, what would you say? A gentle smoke? Did you say? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
But it is there when you sort of like breathe out almost after that sip. It's there, and it's just. It's not at all like if you were to drink a peated whiskey, don't get me wrong. It's nothing like that. This is not a smoked whiskey. It's just that little bit of almost, barrel char. Somebody in the background has had a fire in the distance sort of thing. And it's definitely got to be a barrel influence from that. But it's a very clean spirit. And it's
very clean and very good. And see, this was when I first announced that I was doing New Zealand whiskey nights. When I first started talking on my own channels about New Zealand whiskey generally, I did get some pushback. People telling me New Zealand whiskey's no good, it's rubbish, why would you do that, Scotch is better, all of those kinds of things. And I think just taking a step back, there is a real cultural cringe in New Zealand, what locally known as that tall poppy syndrome.
Yes.
Where you try and do anything good, and there will always be people who try to cut you down. Looking back into some of the whiskey that was being made in New Zealand in the 70s and the 80s, when there was far less of a regulation around a spirits industry, there was some rough stuff being made. And so what I've found is that most of the people who are telling me that New Zealand whiskey is rubbish hadn't had anything in the last 5 years, simply hadn't tried enough, and just going back to those old tropes of how on earth could New Zealand, little old New Zealand, compete against some of the Scotlands, the Americans, those much bigger distilling nations with much longer pedigrees. That's the reason that New Zealand has got a New Zealand Music Month in the month of May, was because New Zealand radio stations simply weren't playing New Zealand music.
Oh, right, okay.
And because there was this whole cultural cringe idea of, well, when you've got the UK and America and Europe creating all of this good music, why would we listen to little old New Zealand? And it took a champion there to really build it up and to say, no, well, of course New Zealand can make good music.
Yeah.
Do we need a New Zealand Whiskey Month? I will absolutely fight for that. I think that would be great. But it starts at a level here where we're saying, actually...
I'm going to write that down, Cameron.
That there is... New Zealand can and does make good whiskey and good spirits in general.
And here's the facts about New Zealand, right? New Zealand is small, but it has an incredible grain industry down here. The farming down here, the farmland is awesome. And so the barley that's being grown down here in Canterbury, which is what's supplying most of these distilleries, is phenomenal. It's world-class barley. The Australians are buying it up for their beer and whiskey over there.
Oh, right.
And it's going all the way over to the UK and Europe as well. It's very high quality. And then on top of that, we have our water, which, you can't really get much better water in the whole world, really. I mean, there are mountains, 100 kilometers away, and those glaciers and that snow melt is just coming right down here to the cities. And most of these distilleries are either on a spring or they're at the bottom of a mountain, and they're collecting that pristine glacier water. And then you add on our unique environment, our climate, which is somewhere, it's not as cool and as rainy as Scotland, but it's not also as hot as the United States, for example. It's somewhere in between, So aging times, you just need to write. We need to write a new book, basically, because we don't know anymore, Pokeno, they're saying 3 years, I think is what he said usually about.
Yes, because they've got an extraordinarily high Angel's share.
Exactly, yeah, and it's humidity and stuff that's going on up there, but that would be different from a distillery down in Southland,
I mean, yes, take a Pokeno near the top of New Zealand, us here sitting in Christchurch, roughly the middle, but then again, we've got distilleries in Southland and in Dunedin, and that climate here, to compare it again to Pokeno or further north, Auckland, completely different. But that's another topic for another episode.
Yes, absolutely, yeah, we won't dive into that too fast, because that's... that's another one. But Pokeno, so they've got two other ones, including the Discovery, which was their sherry. No,
yep, sherry barrel.
Sherry barrel. And what was the third?
You're on the website.
I've already left the website. That's a great question. It was...
I should know, I've got the bottles.
Revelation.
There we go.
Pokeno Revelation, which...
that's the red wine?
That's the first fill bourbon and red wine.
Yeah.
And actually the Discovery is also bourbon and sherry. So
yeah.
This one is the most pure expression, just being bourbon, I suppose, if you will. Yeah, none of that other barrel influence. I love it. I just gotta say, I need the bottles, the box that they come in, everything about what they've done for this branding and this whiskey is just awesome. And I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot more about Pokeno in more episodes in the future, because we've got at least 4 of them here to try for sure. So
I've got 3 bottles at home.
There you go. There's a whole season on Pokeno whiskey.
That would have to, if we could get head distiller Matt down here. But they are doing, and so it's exciting to talk about Pokeno because they are available across the United States.
Yep.
And I did see on their social media recently that they've just done an outreach and launch in China.
Oh, wow.
The fact, again, you're talking about filling 700ml bottles is no mean feat.
Yeah.
The fact that they already, having just launched in market last year, they're already exporting to the US, and they're already exporting to China.
Containers is what they've said. Yeah. Containers of the stuff.
They, clearly they have got a great output and they've got a great supply.
Yeah.
Credit to them, because I think what it means is that for most of these people, China is a massive whiskey market in general, and I think that there will be many curious buyers in the US. There is a very high chance that their first introduction to New Zealand whiskey is going to be Pokeno.
And I think, thank God, I think when somebody's going to try this across the world, they're going to think, what else is New Zealand making? They're going to think that is world class. This is so good, So
yeah,
kudos to them. Yeah, kudos to the team. They just so we know for a fact, and we'll mention this again, Pokeno is the biggest distillery in New Zealand. They're on a level that's probably above what you would consider usually a craft distillery. Probably it is an industrial distillery, but it is. They're doing really craft stuff, and I love it. I think what they're doing up there, including some of the fun casks they've made.
Well, that's the other thing, is that they are the only distillery in New Zealand to have their own cooper, which really opens up opportunities, because if they say, hey, we want to make a barrel out of this crazy wood, they actually have the skilled person on site who can make that. And I think on a future episode, talking about their Totara wood release. So Totara is a wood native to New Zealand. So when they release a barrel to say, hey, we've got a whiskey that's been aged in a Totara barrel, that's a world first and a New Zealand first, and certainly something to talk about on a future episode.
Absolutely, yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about with Pokeno Orange at the moment?
I mean, only that they're amazing. Aaron is their sales rep, who ran that tasting in Christchurch that we both went to, and I think having him and or Matt on a future episode for an interview would be amazing.
Absolutely.
Putting that out there.
If anybody out there knows them, get them in touch. Okay, let's move on to our second whiskey for this one. And this one is really going back to New Zealand's craft whiskey almost origins, really. I mean, if you're going to say, like, who was the first whiskey distiller on the scene, really, who are you going to say?
Well, Thomson was certainly one of the ones that was widely available at an earlier stage. Have they put a year on this one?
Yeah, I don't know if they're the first per se, but if I was to think, who's the first one to really give this a go?
Here we're getting into dangerous territory. Okay. Are we talking about the first distillery? No, because New Zealand does have an older distilling scene that very much fizzled out during that period of time in the 1980s when whiskey was fizzling out around the world.
So let's speak in terms of the resurgence of craft whiskey.
If we're saying that, who played a major role in kicking off the revival here, absolutely Thomson. Yeah. I told and this doesn't hold up at all, but I told people in my tasting, because I poured this one then, that this was an expression of New Zealand whiskey. That this was a quote-unquote true New Zealand whiskey, because the distillery is in Auckland, close to the top of the North Island. The grain, the barley, is from here in Christchurch, where we are, and I asked them, where is the peat from? And they wouldn't tell me specifically, but they said Southland. So that is much, much further south than us. So it was kind of these three touch points from across the nation to make a true New Zealand whiskey. But that was,
it's quite interesting too, because if you look at the map of New Zealand, it's actually kind of the invert of what would be the UK. The cold part is at the bottom, and the hot part is at the top. So when you're thinking of the UK and how Scotland's at the top, you get your peat from Scotland. Well, but down here it's the opposite. We're getting it from the bottom. So,
well, I mean, the sticker on this one, winning a gold medal at the 2016 Spirits Awards, tells you that certainly for 2016, that I don't know if this bottle's from 2016, but certainly if they've been producing and winning medals since then at least, predates Pokeno being on the market for quite some time.
So Thomson, they're a small distillery, and they are up in Auckland, like we said. They actually share, that was a unfortunate cork pop.
That was weak, but hey.
They share their space with, I don't know how to say it.
Hallertau,
I think. Hallertau Brewing Company. So they're actually in the back room, and they've got their still set up. It's a beautiful copper pot still that Matt, the head distiller, has customized into his own whiskey still. I believe it was a brandy still from Spain or Portugal, is my recollection of it. So he's set up back in there, and he's actually grown. He's got a bigger still as well now, but this would have been back in the earlier days, I'm thinking.
But it's how do you save on costs? At this point in time, how do you save on costs? One, sharing your facilities, but two, if you've got a facility that's already brewing, great.
Yeah, it's there.
It sounds like the best kind of flatmate you can have when you're trying to launch a business and get it off the ground.
Absolutely, yeah. And we should mention what this is. This is the South Island Peat expression. Did we say that already?
I think so.
Anyway, this is Thomson's South Island Peat. It is a progress report, is what they've called it on the bottle. So I guess they don't believe it's their end goal for it, is it? I'm not sure, but it's widely available down here. And what I like about New Zealand whiskey, and I haven't touched on this yet, is just how And it's the Kiwi ingenuity of it all. You know, like Kiwis, they just have this like, I'll do it no matter what sort of like, mentality. And if you don't know, listener, I'm Canadian, so I'm not from here, but I've been living here like 7 years, and I kind of have gotten a good understanding of what makes up this Kiwi mentality. And it's that they're just going to do it no matter what. And I sort of took that on when I started in the garage with Herrick Creek. But like for them to do this in the back of somebody else's brewery, and then still put barrels down and put out the amount of bottles they did, 700 mils. Mm-hmm. They've always done 700 mil bottles, which is respectable. I just think it's great. I think it's good stuff. And nowadays there's a lot of different expressions you can get from Thomson. Anyway, why don't you have a smell and a taste? And I'll read to you what it says on their website. It's very short and sweet. It just says, made from 100% New Zealand grown malted barley, smoked using South Island peat, and distilled through our copper pot stills with notes of iodine, smoke, and sweet vanillins. It's 46% alcohol.
Well, see, on the nose, there's a difference because bugbear, when people say that it's smoky when it's peated. And using peated and smoky interchangeably as descriptors.
Absolutely, yeah.
And because this is it's more ash. I get on that nose. I'm getting a real kind of ashy, like leftover from the fire.
I'd even almost say close to a cigarette ashtray. That not that acridness, but like
more cigar than cigarette.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And that is just, yes. So forget any comparison you might have towards an Islay-style whiskey.
It must be known that New Zealand peat is not Scottish peat.
No.
100% it's not. And while it has very small similarities, it is just not the same,
Yes, it's not quite as big or as just from a peat component. Not quite as big. And while it's also this particular expression is not heavily peated, I wouldn't say.
No.
It's not in your face. It's a wonderfully gentle ashiness.
Yeah, and it's funny because some of the other New Zealand whiskies I've had using the peat smoked barley from here in Canterbury, they actually have more of a bacon smell to them, but this one doesn't have that at all. It's more that ash. You're definitely right. In fact, like if you gave this to me and didn't tell me it was peat, I don't know if I'd say it was peat. I'd say it was smoky. I'd for sure say it was smoky, but I don't know if I'd say peat. And that's quite interesting because that just sort of speaks to not only the distillation method, maybe his blending methods. We don't know if it's blended or not. I don't really know the exact details, but also just the New Zealand peat in general. It's just different. Yeah.
Definitely, there's a sweetness, and the iodine. If you say iodine smoked, I immediately think of Lefroy. You can't separate those two. But to try and compare this to Lefroy is a disservice. It's certainly, for starters, I think it's a mistake to be comparing New Zealand whiskey to Scotch or to because it is its own style and it's doing its own thing. We're not trying to emulate another country.
No.
We're making our own spirits and proudly in our own style.
Yeah.
But
that's something that people have to understand when they hear us talking about these different terms. Just because you've heard them in Scotch doesn't mean it's the same for New Zealand whiskey. And hopefully we can help chat about that and just explore what the difference is. But we're not going to say one of these is comparable to this one in Scotland. We're not going to try and do that. I don't think really.
No, because that's missing the point.
Yeah.
Scotland is doing its own thing.
Yeah.
Has been doing its own thing for a while.
Absolutely.
And that is not what the New Zealand whiskey scene is trying to do. It's not trying to emulate another country.
It'd be like in the States saying, I had a bourbon, I'm going to compare it to a Scotch. You can't do it, Like they're just different, And even though the terms and stuff may be somewhat different, they're just not the same. So I was just tasting. I had my first taste of this, and I got to say, unlike I said on the nose, it didn't smell peaty. Mm-hmm. On the taste, it tastes peaty though.
Yes, that kind of light ashiness definitely it rounds out. There's a sweetness underneath that I'm trying to like candy floss.
Yeah.
And the lingering, again, this is one with a beautiful finish, and it does turn into a much more well-rounded, smokier finish that's sitting there at the back of the throat. And I think it's a fantastic expression of a New Zealand peated whiskey.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be quite exciting to delve into the different smoked whiskies in New Zealand, because there's actually quite a few. There's different styles, different woods and such. But this one's just a classic one. You can find this in almost every liquor store, probably in New Zealand, I think. Hey.
Yes, certainly one of the more readily available, readily accessible. Thomson is another one that in most chain liquor stores that you'll find around New Zealand.
Yeah, and it's a good starting smoky whiskey, I think, as well.
Yeah, for a New Zealand peated whiskey, for sure.
I think, if you were to say, we're going to go for an unsmoked beginner whiskey with Pokeno origin, and then a beautiful smoky beginner with Thomson South Island Peat, I think those are two good starting points for anybody looking to get into New Zealand whiskey for the first time.
I don't know how much you would be able to find of Thomson. While very available nationwide, I don't know how much success you're going to have overseas.
You're absolutely right. I do think there's some bit of distribution in the UK. Okay. So if you're in the UK, have a look. And maybe Australia. It's the closest thing to us. Usually there's something over there.
True.
But you're right. I don't know what else. Yeah. There's a lot to explore in there, really. And it's just a big chewy sweetness with that smoke. It's like a sweet smoke somehow too, eh? With that ash, like the ash is there, but it's just that sweet peaty smoke.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
So, if we're talking about New Zealand whiskey in general, we'll just keep sipping on this as we keep going through now. There's quite a few producers, but there's not a huge amount of producers either. And what do you think? Do you think there's a New Zealand style? If we look even in just these two, do you think this is a New Zealand style?
I think we're developing that. There's a certain element of developing that as we go. I remember somebody asking me at one of the New Zealand tasting events that I was running about whether or not in New Zealand we're going to get whiskey regions like they have in Scotland. And I said, I don't think... as a country, geographically, we're of a similar kind of size to the UK, not population-wise. But so do I think we could get a region? Maybe, if we're to fast forward a significant amount of time. But in the meantime, I'm really more interested in seeing the kind of style that we can develop, whether or not there is a thread that you're able to pull through the producers to really say, yes, this is a New Zealand whiskey. I don't know if we're there yet, but I certainly think it is still very much early days in this resurgence that we've got.
I think in the future we'll definitely do an episode on the idea of New Zealand whiskey regions, potentially. I think there's a discussion there for sure. And I think there's enough distilleries and whiskey around now that we could compare and maybe see, these are the discussions we've got to have, Cameron. We're doing this for the people. we're sacrificing our bodies for this.
Oh, well, I can certainly think of worse ways.
Exactly. If you have any questions about New Zealand whiskey in general, you can definitely let us know. Our email is distilnationnz@gmail.com, and you can find us on all socials at distilnationnz. And just let us know. There's got to be questions out there.
The number of questions I see coming up for people who are authorities on bourbon and on American whiskey, and there's lots of conversations that they're having, which is great. I'm very much enjoying. I think America just beat New Zealand to the punch in terms of having their industry body coming up with a definable American single malt.
Yes.
So they beat us there. But they're having those conversations, which are great. So yes, as much as we can have conversations amongst ourselves, it would be great if you could write in, let us know what questions do you have. What is it that you want to know about this amazing category of New Zealand whiskey?
Absolutely. Now, if again, we just want to remind everybody, if you're a New Zealand distiller, if anybody out there is working in a distillery in New Zealand, please reach out to us. If you've got anything, you've got any news or anything like that, you want to let us tell everyone else, just let us know. You know, that's what we're here for. We're here to be megaphones for the industry. But I thought we'd actually dive into a bit of news for the first time.
Let's go.
Yeah, spirit news for New Zealand. I'll start with myself. Here at Creek, we've got a little bit going on right now. We've got a new batch of gin out for 9 Fathoms, and then we've also got our blue corn coming out soon. I'll talk more about that for sure in the future.
I'm excited about that.
I'm very excited.
Because this is going to be the first ever release of a blue corn whiskey in New Zealand.
Absolutely, yeah. So anyway, we'll talk about that in the future.
Okay.
Cardrona, they've got a new whiskey out. Pre-orders right now for their new The Falcon release. Have you seen that one?
I have.
Yeah.
I have. Which is funny when they started with just hatched fledgling.
Yes.
So clearly naming
somebody was thinking about this 10 years ago.
They've got a theme. They've got a theme.
So yeah, it's called The Falcon. It's a full 700ml release for them, which they've only just started doing. They used to only do 375s. It's from 3 hand-selected casks drawn from some of their oldest stock and reduced to 52%. So it's still pretty up there. I don't know how much they've reduced it, because it's still pretty high.
Well, most of their 375ml bottles they've sold at full cask strength of
64. Or
yes,
like that,
they're up there in the mid 60% ish.
Yeah.
So
Cardrona Distillery is down in between Wanaka and Queenstown in the Cardrona Valley. Some amazing stuff. We'll talk about them for sure in the future. That's the news I had for them.
Great.
And then 1919 Distillery up in Auckland. They're predominantly a gin distillery. They have a new lime gin limited release out. And so if anybody's interested in some lime gin, sounds really nice. And it's limited to 70 bottles. So
see, they've had a couple of whiskey releases
Yes.
that I have tried to get my hands on, but because they are very, very limited, and it was very much like you had to register your interest and go in the draw kind of thing, and I have not been successful in winning. But I was at a tasting event where a number of New Zealand distillers were represented, and I did get to try some of it there. Amazing stuff. Definitely looking forward to seeing what they come out with.
And it might be sooner than you think, from what I've seen. We'll have more news, I'm sure, on that as we can, and I'm sure we'll talk to Soren, who's the distiller there, at some point as well.
Perfect.
Finally, some sadder news. Just a little bit of a sad note at the end here is that Juniper Distilling over in Rangiora, they lost their distiller recently, Sean Juniper. Really sad. Sean's been an incredible guy around here in Canterbury. He's come to a lot of events. I've had a great number of discussions with him, and he was a wealth of knowledge, and he's definitely missed. It's very sad.
I didn't know him well. I turned up to Juniper Collective, which is a boutique gin shop in Christchurch, and they have an event every Friday afternoon called Distiller Fridays. And so that's an opportunity to go down, have a wee bit of a sample, usually talk to the distiller or a rep from the distillery, and that particular Friday afternoon that I happened to go down, it was Juniper Distillery, and Sean was there. I hadn't gone in intending to buy a Juniper gin. But of course he was there, so ended up trying a few, talking to him, and buying a bottle because he was friendly, he was welcoming, he was knowledgeable. Condolences both to his family and to the Rangiora community. Where I know that he went out and did the markets and all of those things there. Way too young.
The good news,
way too young.
The good news from it all, if there's any, I mean, obviously it's terrible sadness, but his family's going to keep it going. They've really promised they're going to say, we're going to do it, and Sean had a dream, and we're going to actually make this go much bigger. So, good on them for doing that. Sean's missed for sure, and unfortunate.
Way too young.
Yeah.
Way too young.
So on that note, we're going to wrap up today our episode on the introduction to New Zealand whiskey. I think it's been quite interesting, to actually... I've never actually tasted these side by side. Right? No, you wouldn't really usually because it's smoky versus unsmoked. But I think, this has been a really good these are two good options for people getting into New Zealand whiskey. And now that we kind of know what New Zealand whiskey is, I'm sure we'll talk about it more. You know, we can definitely go over it in the future. We can go from here. We can explore more whiskeys, more flavors, more distilleries, more regions, all these sort of things. What do you think?
I think having the DSA, Distilled Spirits Aotearoa, is doing a great job actually having got that kind of framework in place to say this is what we want a New Zealand whiskey to be.
Yep.
Next step is really getting it enshrined in law.
Yep.
So that will be the next step. Won't be happening anytime soon because wheels of justice turn slowly.
Yes.
But, it's great that we actually have that framework and that definition because that's what gives people like you who are making it, the boundaries within which to play, and it gives people like me, those consumers, that there's a trust there of if we go out and we buy something and it says New Zealand single malt whiskey, we can have confidence of knowing exactly what it is that's in that bottle.
Yeah, and one thing I'd love to see, just as a quick note, I mean, I'd love to see a way that we can display on these bottles that we're part of the DSA, just so that people know that I'm not just some, rogue distiller out to make a quick buck or something like that. That they know I've actually put in the effort to go through the guidelines and that I'm a part of that association. So hopefully, as a group, we come up with something for that soon enough. But yeah, this has been fun. I'm excited about it.
Indeed.
Yeah, and I just want to remind everyone to subscribe. I'm sure there's a way to get notifications on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts, YouTube, of course. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. And if you have questions, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to take any questions, no matter how silly you think they are. There's no stupid questions, right? There's only stupid answers, is it?
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Cheers.